From saying that no LIV Golf member is good enough to be on his Ryder Cup team, to getting absolutely dragged by the fans for his comments, here's why Rory McIlroy rejects LIV stars on the European team. The Irishman's arguably the biggest Saudi League critic out there, getting into all sorts of scraps with their players, or just straight up saying that the circuit's destined to fail. In spite of this quote-unquote rivalry though, people still thought Rory would be friends with golfers on the breakaway tour. After all, these guys were his colleagues and friends at one point. But it turns out he's taking no prisoners when it comes to his rivalry with the league, because he thinks not a single one of them is good enough for his Ryder Cup team. Which, let's be fair, is wild considering just how much Team Europe has struggled over the past couple of decades against the US, and how many of their top players are actually a part of LIV Golf now. Here's the fascinating bit though. When asked about whether he's changed his stance on including some of these golfers in Team EU, Rory didn't just dive straight into it like he's done before. Instead, he was quite clever with his answer and shut down plenty of people who would have raised question marks. I mean, of course, he still thinks they're not good enough to compete in the tournament, but he still says there's one guy on the American side who deserves to be a part of the US Ryder Cup team. And it wouldn't take a genius to figure out who he was talking about. Yep. It's the 2023 PGA Championship winner, Brooks Koepka. Rory says that only Brooks deserves to be on the US team, purely based on the way he's played this season. Not to mention, he's second in the US standings after only playing 2-point earning events. On top of that, not only did he win the PGA Championship, he also finished second at the Masters. As for everyone else on the LIV Golf roster, yeah, Rory says none of them deserve to be on the team based on merit and how they're playing. Though he did also admit he's just got different feelings over on the European side because of everything that's happened, so maybe he's a bit biased. And yes, he would be right. After all, he forgot to mention some of the most successful Ryder Cup players of all time. Seriously, just thinking about some of the golfers that are going to miss out on the event because of this rivalry. Are you telling me that Sergio Garcia isn't good enough for Rory's team? The guy who scored the most points and has the highest number of wins in the history of the competition? Plus, the dude also won the Nicklaus Jacklin Award in 2020 for his performances, so it's not like he's washed up or anything like that either. Sure, Rory was kind enough to hand it to Koepka, but let's be fair, most people would have grilled him if he hadn't. I mean, Koepka's just on another level right now, and in big events like Ryder Cup, he could be the clutch player that makes the difference. That being said, he wasn't the only guy who finished second at Augusta National. Phil Mickelson did too. But Rory, being the wily old fox that he is, simply chose to ignore Lefty. Why? Well, because he's got beef with the guy, of course. At the same time though, you understand where he's coming from too. Because truth be told, it's not like the LIV guys have acted nice ever since they've switched sides. In fact, players like Sergio Garcia aren't even a part of the DP World Tour anymore, which makes their inclusion in Team Europe all the more complicated. Oh, and yeah, even if you don't agree with what Rory's got to say about the matter, you've got to at least respect him because he hasn't changed his stance at all. Even if you rewind back to the summer of 2022, when all this talk of Ryder Cup exclusions was going down, the Irishman was still adamant that he wasn't going to have any LIV players on the European team. And most of it, as he's already mentioned, comes down to his feud with the league. I mean, where do you even begin with the things he said? He thinks that there's no room in the golf world for LIV Golf, and that he'd be super happy if it just simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Not to mention, he also thinks it's ripping the sport apart. Oh, and don't even get me started on his feud with the league's CEO, Greg Norman. Sure, these guys had beef before Greg got involved with the LIV, but still, Rory asking for his resignation was arguably one step too far. That said, most of these things start to make sense when you consider the fact that Rory's actually a player director on the PGA Tour's policy board, so he's very heavily involved with all the politics. In fact, he was actually one of the driving forces behind the tour's schedule changes, including the elevated events. The point is that he's a leader for the PGA, or as Greg would put it, a mouthpiece for them, which is why he has to take shots at the rival tour and undermine it. As for Norman, well, he thinks Rory's just obsessed with the league and doesn't have a clue about what he's saying. And to be fair, the Irishman is a bit isolated with his stance against LIV Golf. Because even Jon Rahm thinks that selection for the Ryder Cup needs to be done without any bias. He feels like the equation for the tournament is actually very simple. You just pick the best European golfers and pit them against the best Americans. What's more, the Spaniard says that whatever's happening with the LIV golf feud and all that jazz just shouldn't matter for an event like this. Instead, whoever's best suited to represent the European side should be included in the team. Oh, and remember when I mentioned Sergio Garcia? Yeah, the 2023 Masters champion also echoed a similar sentiment, because according to him, it's hard to believe that the most successful player in the history of Team Europe in the Ryder Cup isn't fit to be on the team. So, John feels like Rory taking that stance is a bit unfortunate, and he's going to miss playing alongside golfers like Garcia. What's more, he's also sad about the fact that politics have gotten in the way of the Ryder Cup, which has definitely deflated some of the excitement that people had coming into the 2023 season. That being said, Rom is still hopeful for the European side, because he thinks this could allow some promising young players to step up and make their mark on the team. But while John's obviously not going to rip into Rory for his comments, considering they're both PGA Tour colleagues, you can't say the same for golfers on the other side of the fence. So guess who's come out to call the Irishman out this time around? Of course, it's the ever-controversial Phil Mickelson. Now, Lefty's been on an absolute roll on Twitter over the past few years, getting into feuds with journalists, other golfers, and even fans. It's like he's got some sort of bat signal that lights up whenever someone's trying to criticize him or LIV golf. So, when Rory made his comments, Lefty instantly logged onto Twitter and took him to the cleaners. First, he called out how the Irishman hasn't been performing well in 2023, and how worn out he looked after the Masters. And to be fair, Rory has said that the PGA Tour schedule's getting a bit too hectic for him, especially with all these feuds added into the mix. Well, Phil decided to remind him that the grass is greener on the LIV side because their schedule's a lot more open, which allows them to compete better during major events. Oh, and yeah, you could apply the same logic to the Ryder Cup too, since LIV players would actually be much fresher than their PGA Tour counterparts. So, Phil cheekily said that the Saudi League would be perfect for someone like Rory, except that there's a minor problem. What problem? Well, Phil thinks that no LIV team would accept the Irishman into their ranks, because then they'd have to deal with all his BS. Mic drop. If you thought that was the end of humiliation for Rory though, think again. After all, the fans also grilled him for his comments. Oh, and let me tell you, people were brutal. One Twitter user, for instance, said that he shouldn't be part of the European team either because he's awful, while another said that he should just shut up and play for the US team. I mean, let's be fair, he does spend more time on the PGA Tour now than on the DP World Tour. That said, there were a couple of people supporting him too, saying that, yeah, LIV players are definitely not good enough to represent Europe on the big stage. So hey, not everyone's against Rory here. And there you have it. From getting absolutely dragged by the fans for his comments, to saying that no LIV golf member is good enough to be on his Ryder Cup team, this is why Rory McIlroy rejects LIV stars on the European team.